So, Ralph, that was a wonderful story, and I wish that I, in some ways, could just stop and pull apart all the things that you just said about the importance of having both that kind of adult to help you reflect, but also the importance of what you were actually able to do in terms of bringing that sense of what you should do in that situation, and how that really sort of, not only surprised everyone, but really transformed and helped you build this relationship. But let's push forward. We are delighted that you did leave the Virgin Islands and managed to make it to the U.S. You've made an incredible contribution over the years to helping to change the odds for children and youth. But in this last version, you have zoomed in on early childhood and this idea of reading readiness and getting young people really reading on grade level, and the importance of early literacy. So give us a few sentences about the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, why you started it, and really how it's grown up as this really sort of grassroots local movement. And then we'll go on to understand why now you're pushing ahead to talk about a Learning Happens Everywhere initiative. So why this campaign?
In 2007, I had an opportunity to say to the chairman of the KC board that I would not be a candidate for CEO. And he in turn asked me to do a couple of things and said, "What will it take?" And I said, 5 years of support for the Grade Level Reading Initiative. And Jim Kelly, who was then recent chair of UPS and was the chair of the KC board, said, "You got it." And he says, "You know why?" And I said, "Why?" He says, "You just made that up. And you don't know what it is, and I don't know what it is, but we're going to figure this thing out together over the next couple of years." And we did. And I had come to the conclusion that traditional philanthropy, as I am proud to have practiced it at the KC Foundation, had reached the end of the line in terms of what it was doing. And I could not see any value to be gained from yet another demonstration project. That we had enough information, we had enough evidence to know some things that we should stop doing, and to try to actually take the risk and make a difference. And so in developing a plan for going forward, I thought that we should invest in a number of campaigns that would reduce the number of children in foster care by 50%, that would contribute to reducing poverty by 50%, that would increase the number of kids reading on grade level, that would deal with the juvenile justice system, but really make an effort to actually do something and hold ourselves accountable for moving the needle, for producing outcomes, and for making an impact. And I thought that that would be a far better use of my time than running a foundation and designing a set of new demonstration initiatives. And the one that interested me most, it was half in 10, the campaign to actually take on what is the moral issue of our time, and that is generational poverty. And what I realized, if you really care about generational poverty, that we had to build a coalition of folks, most of whom poverty was not their number one issue. But we had to build a coalition of people who would take on poverty simply because it was getting in the way of something they wanted to do. And what seemed to me one of the best ways to do that was to look at people who really cared about young children, who had a commitment to young children doing better, and especially those folks who were concerned about early school success. And I was convinced that they were the low-hanging fruit, because we're not going to achieve early school success unless we actually took on the drivers of poverty. Because poverty is the major super spreader of the challenges young children face. And if you're going to take on poverty and you're going to take on early school success, you've got to find a meaningful metric, one that is not only meaningful, but one that is easy to communicate and around which you can get people to rally. And there's a deep consensus that children ought to learn to read. And beneath that consensus is an understanding that we've got to teach children to read. And the evidence that we have of the connection between reading and later school success and high school graduation and the path out of poverty not only was strong, but it met the standard of common sense. And so we could build a coalition around third grade reading. And as people gravitated to saying that that was important to do, we would end up having them join the army that it will take to disrupt generational poverty. So the campaign, that's why we say, and we say in the very first line of practically every document about the campaign, our mission is to disrupt generational poverty by taking on one of the predictors and markers of generational poverty, and that's the large number of children who don't read on grade level by the time they get to third grade. And that third grade milestone is a key marker of early school success.
I really appreciate your taking the time to tell that full story. I knew it, but it's good to have it refreshed and put out for our listeners. The other thing about the strategy is that specific word, campaign. There are many people who have tackled anything, grade level reading, etc., by coming in and saying, we have to get the system to do this better. You didn't do that. You didn't focus your energy on, we have to get schools to teach reading better. The army that you're talking about, mobilizing, is an army of parents and community adults who actually see kids and can contribute to this. And not only can they contribute to the larger issues of poverty, you really made it your purpose to make sure they knew they could contribute to this very specific goal of engaging young children in learning to read and learning to love reading and engaging their parents along the way. So why that strategy? Why not the traditional, let's get in there and hope the schools have better reading protocols?
I will put two names into the conversation that will amuse you. One, Sid Gardner. The second, B.J. Walker. Sid Gardner, as you know, was one of the most remarkable leaders. He could pack more meaning into 6 words than virtually anybody. He was short-tempered and economical in terms of his words, but powerful. And he says, you only need 5,000 people to make change. And the real challenge is figuring out who the 5,000 people are and how you get to them. And that he reduced a lot of the work we were doing to that one key goal. B.J. Walker, very early in her fellowship at Casey, said, Ralph, you know, as I look at what we're doing, we're all working on supply, but very few are still working on demand. And I credit B.J. Walker and Sid Gardner as helping to push me toward formulating a notion that you don't have to reach everybody. You've got to reach the key constituents, and you've got to spend time, energy, and resources on that constituency. And what you've got to do is to find the early adopters and then sweep in the next round and use that next round to sweep in the third, and you build out to your 5,000. And the object of that is to essentially mobilize demand, mobilize informed and incessant demand. And at Casey, we talked about it as authentic demand. Would the people in the community demand this even after the dollars were gone? That was our job, was to create, mobilize, and sustain authentic demand, that we had to make our strategies become so aligned with the aspiration of the people who lived, worked, and worshiped in the community that they would continue to seek the solution long after the Casey Foundation had moved on. So this notion for us is really at the core of the campaign, not to focus on supply, but to focus on demand, not to focus on the big policymakers, but really to ask folks in the community to work with us and walk with us toward a goal that they could understand, that they could embrace, and that they could own. And that's why one of the things about the campaign, about which I'm most proud, is we have not recruited any communities since 2014. Not because we made a choice, because we didn't have the capacity to recruit. The campaign has more than doubled the number of communities since then, because people are looking and hearing from what's happening next door, in the community next door and the county next door. And they're joining the campaign. They're saying, we want to join. We want to join because they're seeing something happening, and they're hearing people like them talk about it, and they want to share in that work, in the trials and tribulations, and in the joy of moving forward and on the aspirations they value. It is, in many respects, inspired by what we saw Jeff Canada do. And I think those of us who were in New York in the fall of 2009 and saw 100 communities jam that ballroom at the Marriott or wherever it was, and more than 100 communities annoyed that they could not get in. What we saw is Jeff was able to make people across the country say, if Jeff Canada believes that these little black children from Harlem are going to finish high school, go to college, finish college, and really make a contribution with their lives, these little black children in my community could probably do the same thing. And I want to do, and we want to do what Jeff Canada is doing. The Harlem Children's Zone inspired a movement across this country that was the best expression we could find of what authentic demand looked like. And in many respects, that movement was dissipated and undermined by moving the way we did to a limited number of promised neighborhoods that were federally funded, and we created 20 and then 40 winners and hundreds of losers. And that, which was the most important and most authentic campaign in our lifetime, didn't fulfill its promise because we didn't allow it to have the oxygen that it needed. We essentially moved and translated it into a currency, created a level of scarcity, perception of scarcity, and in doing so, essentially dishonored the authentic demand that had been built, not built because of money, but built because people were inspired by what they saw and could see, could understand, could embrace, and could own the vision and aspiration that Jeff had put out there. In some respects, that has moved us to try to keep the campaign for grade level reading as a very close to the ground effort with a number of initiatives that are not competing with each other, that are not competed for a few pilot programs, but have the oxygen and the local momentum to continue to struggle and to strive for something that has meaning to them and to their communities.
I want to dig into this idea of authentic demand, and I want to really push you on this idea of ownership, which I think is critical. The cautionary tale that you told about sort of trying to make these things too formal and putting too much money into them in some ways to make pilot programs when we really could be doing a campaign is one that I think we have to take to heart, and I certainly will take to heart as we think about how we bring these ideas up into work that we're doing with adolescents and young adults. But this idea of authentic demand linked to a clear vision of what success could look like, not just for all young people, but as you said, for black children, was linked to an idea of ownership. And so I want to put a word in there, which is when we think about demand, we're demanding of someone. Who was the target? How do we get from demand to ownership? How did you get this to not just be, we are demanding this of our schools, so we're in advocacy mode, but we're demanding this of ourselves and our community, so we're in innovation and building mode?
I think that's a good question. Let me just put it in the context that demand is not just about advocacy. It's really this kind of more of the economic supply and demand. Do we have a market for what we're selling? and so much of advocacy and so much of philanthropy is about affecting the supply without ensuring that it is what the end user wants, needs, understands, could use. And so this notion of ownership invites us to invest the time in this notion of ownership cannot be separated from a sense of efficacy and cannot be separated from working on agency. That we need to have a narrative, a different narrative, and to spend the time creating a different narrative around low-income parents. In many respects, in even those of us who are doing this work, behave, not necessarily talk, but behave as though low-income parents are not worthy of their children. That they're low income because they made some bad decisions with their own lives, and we're skeptical about whether they can be trusted to make good decisions about their children's lives. And so, without thinking too much, we essentially ask them to take our word for it, that the goal for their children should be college and career ready. And we use these terms and we all know what they mean, and we move forward. And we're talking about a population that didn't finish high school, so have no experience with college, a population that has a frail attachment to jobs and no sense of a career. But we are telling them that kids should be college and career ready and expecting them to go along with it because we say so. And we have not taken the time to say, to do what we say we should do, and that's start where parents are. And ask, what is it that we could do to ensure that parents have bold goals for their own children? Not that they adopt our goals, but they have bold goals for their own children. And which means that our role could be ensuring that parents have the exposure and the range of experiences that will allow them to develop and embrace bold goals. That's different from substituting our goals for theirs. And we don't take the step and say, what is it that we could do to help? We know where these kids belong, and we're pushing forward and not investing the time, not having the patience to have their parents own those goals. For example, Karen, there are some programs that take parents of young children to college for the weekend. You know, when mom gets a chance to go to that library, sit and listen to that lecture, see that lab, have a meal in the cafeteria, stay overnight in the dorm, you know, there's very little power on earth that is going to persuade that mom that her daughter or child shouldn't have the experience of going to that college, listening to that lecture, being in that library, sleeping in that dorm in probably the same bed. Because now she knows and understands what we're talking about. And she becomes a powerful ally in our effort. And that's one of the reasons I really like college savings funds. We don't spend enough time exposing mom and dad to what we mean by careers and giving them the experience so that they could envision themselves. And if they can't envision, and if they think it's too late for them, they begin to do what many of us do, live our lives through our children and say, I didn't get there, but my kid could get there. We don't give parents the opportunity to grasp the bold gold. And because we don't give them the opportunity to grasp it, we're out here working real hard, being real conscientious, caring a lot, but caring a lot for and about other people's kids because we don't have enough confidence or patience that they really, given the opportunity, will do better by their kids than we do. And so, I know that is a long answer to a short question, but at the root of much of what we do wrong is that we give lip service to parents, insufficient attention to demand, we step over agency, we don't allow opportunities for efficacy, and so we leave parents with judgment and blame and a narrative which disempowers them, and then we pretend if somehow we're going to be able to do this, and if we succeed, which we usually and mostly will, if we don't succeed, which we won't, then we can come back and blame the parents all over again. And how we turn that upside down really is the work of the campaign, to say we've got to have the patience, the time, the inclination, the motivation, the will and the skill to enable parents to envision bold goals for their kids, to support them in achieving those goals, and to be with them when they celebrate progress and success.
So, Ralph, in the 15 minutes that we've got left in this incredible interview, I want to get you to zoom back in and be specific about this Learning Happens Everywhere campaign. But before we do that, I want you to just give us a very concrete example of how you have been engaging and supporting parents and broad members of the community. And your campaign is incredible because you've got the folks who are the head of the coin-operated laundromats. You've got barber shops. You've got adults in the community who are not educators per se, being engaged and supporting parents in this idea that they really can be pivotal players in their young people's education success, starting with this key goal of making sure that they are capable and engaged readers. So the story that you've talked about earlier of how you grasped a very important and well-accepted goal of the importance of early reading, how did you do that and really move that into community ownership and demand and community demand? And I don't mean advocacy for schools. I mean this network of places and spaces and adults in the community who really believe they can contribute to this goal in meaningful ways and are taking on advice from experts but are doing it themselves. How did you get there, and why is that so important? Why is that so important?
One of the lessons from the last 18 months is that teaching and learning is too important to be left to the schools. That what we call schools, multi-service, multitasking institutions that have been burdened with high expectations for succeeding with teaching and learning, but ill positioned to meet those expectations. And as we think back over the last 18 months, in March of 2020, the major issue after schools closed in response to the pandemic was how we're going to feed students. And for many people, there was the realizations that when it comes to school-age children, school is where they get food. By the time we got to April, and we realized that the notion of a 2-week quarantine was not really what this was about, we were seeing the economy close down. Because how are we going to work if students aren't in school? And so now we began to understand that schools are really the daycare system. We call it daycare when we're talking about very young kids, but it's really the child care system for school-age kids. And it's what allows their parents to do other things because they're safe, custodial care. We hope it's developmentally appropriate with other adults while parents go to work. So we begin to see that schools, they feed kids, they provide child care. By the time we got to May and June, child welfare agencies around the country were seeing a decline in reports of suspected child neglect and child abuse. Now, do we think that decline was because kids were better off in May and June of 2020? No, none of us believe that kids were better off. But what we know is that schools were not in session. Therefore, those adults who watch children and see children all during the year and end up in various ways protecting children, when it comes to May and June and they know those kids are going to be left on their own, they file those reports that say, here's a home to check, here's a child who we suspect maybe. Those reports weren't there. And so the notion of schools as a major aspect of our child welfare surveillance system became prominent. Now we get to summer, and we realize, and we all began saying, well, summer began in March this year. Why? Because we are accustomed to schools closing in the summer and the chaos of trying to figure out how to feed kids, and we do that really poorly, trying to figure out how we provide childcare for kids, and we do that even worse. But somehow we have managed, by all sorts of ways, to survive summer and pray for September and get back in the routine. And this year, I think you were among the people who I heard say summer started in March this year. And as we all said that, it's because we understand and accept the level of chaos for kids when schools are closed in the summer, and we had that chaos in March. And over the past 12 months, as your work and others have lifted up, schools, and it's sometimes captured by talking about social and emotional learning, but what we realize is schools really constitute the community for children. School is where they learn and practice their social skills. It's where they learn and practice their executive function. It is where they develop as human beings. That's the institution, and as we look at schools as communities, schools as child care institutions, schools as child welfare surveillance system, school as where kids get fed and where they find much of their health care, we realize that this is a multifunction, multitasking institution which has a vital role to play and which is probably worth every penny we spend on it before we get to teaching and learning. And then we impose upon this multitasking, multifunction institution that somehow they succeed on teaching and learning. When in fact, what we know about brain development today tells us that school arrives with too little, too late. We now know enough to reject the notion that we ought to leave numeracy and literacy to school. That we have got to figure out, especially for young kids, how we essentially start that teaching and learning function from the time they're born and even before, which means that we have got to figure out how to move the resources to enable parents, families, and other adults in the community to be actively engaged in the lives of children, to acquire the skills and to have the opportunity and to get the supports they need to succeed in that, which takes away from school this omnipotence around teaching and learning and shares it and said this is a shared responsibility. And what we have all over the country in virtually every community is an intuitive understanding on the part of a lot of us that adults who are not teachers and who may not be formally mentors, tutors, or coaches have a responsibility in this teaching and learning enterprise for our kids. And so these programs, which are laundromats and barbershops and museums and libraries and mom and pop stores, represent this sort of intuitive understanding that there is more to do, that this is a shared responsibility, and what we're trying to do by shining a light on those efforts is to create a series of high five moments to affirm this intuition and to wonder with these folks whether we can build collectively the capacity to realize the aspiration that is not always said out loud. These are individual programs, but these individual programs reflect a collective intuition upon which we're trying to build. So learning happens everywhere, affirms both the intuition, the aspiration, and the work that's going on, and invite as an invitation to the folks who are already doing the work to aspire to do it even better and to see it as legitimate work, not work that is in conflict with schools or not work that is rebelling against school, but work that acknowledges that when it comes to teaching and learning, that is one of the many important roles of schools, but it is a role which is too important to be ascribed solely to school, and it is work in which we all must share, and we must find ways in our lives to be part of that, and it means rethinking the role of adults, all adults, in the lives of children. And that is for us one of the most exciting and potentially transformational outcomes from the pandemic.
That was a brilliant statement that I'm sure we'll use in its totality. I want to take a few minutes, and I'm hoping, can you stay for an extra 5 minutes? And Catherine, is that okay? I'm assuming from her silence and everyone else's that it's all right. I want to recap what you said and then ask you a question. What you said, which is I think what a lot of us have realized and been trying to say for a while, is not only that learning happens everywhere and that we need to really galvanize and empower all these adults in settings to really take on their responsibility and use the relationships that they have with young people and their families to really reinforce learning and development. You also said caring happens in schools. Basic care and feeding and protection of young people happens in schools. And that this deeply held thinking that learning happens only in schools and caring happens only in families and communities is something that you want to disrupt. And that, in fact, the pandemic demonstrated for us the falsity of that sort of bifurcated idea that we send kids into this thing to learn and then the community and the families just do care. You've really sort of pushed both of those together in a very important way. Having done that, I want to ask you if you think with the Learning Happens Everywhere campaign that we can take that energy and that commitment and not only use it to reinforce the importance of all adults and all settings and all of these diverse learning approaches that are happening in informal learning in libraries, museums, that we can not only just do that for young children, but we can push that campaign all the way up to make sure that they are college and career ready. Is there something special about the fact that we did it with young children that's going to make it more difficult to keep it going? Or do we, as you start this campaign, do we have an opportunity to push this all the way through the developmental phases?
Well, Karen, I think we began this by saying I've known you for 40 years, and I actually did the math recently, and it's been about 38, not quite 40, but I want to claim the full 40. And over that time, you have had the ability to take fragments of thinking and meanderings of mine and to say succinctly, now the succinct part is not hard, obviously, but but eloquently and powerfully, sort of what I'm thinking and to which I've given inadequate expression. And what you just said in 3.5 minutes is probably what I've been trying to say in the last 30. So I want to acknowledge that. And to say that my tentative answer is yes, I think so, but I don't know for sure. I think we can start this adult movement and have adults, part of adulthood, become the moment that you accept responsibility for making these children our future, making that a statement of personal legacy and responsibility for the next generation. I think it's got to become part of who we are as we become adults. And I don't have enough to know whether that becomes part of adulthood, because if it doesn't become part of adulthood, I think it's a difficult challenge. I think we feel that about very young kids, but when we get to adolescence, the adolescence are angles and attitudes, we kind of lose the exuberance, and we've got to figure out how we hold on to it through adolescence. And I think we need to see the folks who are in roles, who are mentors and coaches and tutors, and most of all, the folks who are educators, whether for young kids or in the K-12, where they see their role as not only teaching and learning for the kid, but they see their role as being in partnership with the parents. And that recasting and redefinition of the role and accepting and embracing this revised and refreshed role, I think will be important to the future. And for many people who prefer kids to adults, and maybe that's why they're in teaching, and there are people who prefer dogs to people and people who prefer kids to adult, it comes as a terrible surprise that they have chosen a profession which we are now defining and redefining not as a one-on-one connection with a kid, but really that hopefully you can do as any adult, but now a one-on-one connection with the kid and those adults that come attached to that kid. And I suspect that there are a lot of people who are in the formal roles as educators, tutors, mentors, and coaches, for whom that will come as a surprise and not a fully pleasant one, and may only be partially embraced. And if I'm correct on that, then the expansion, the upward extension of what we're seeing glimmers of in the early years and early grades may still prove as much of a challenge as it is today.
Well, Ralph, you have challenged me to think about this. I'm going to remain optimistic that we can slowly move the success that you've had in generating this authentic demand up through the age group. We won't jump immediately to teenagers, but the fact that you didn't stop at the school doors in kindergarten, but you took it through third grade, means very intentionally that you're already modeling the fact that this broader set of adults has a shared responsibility, even when young people are enrolled in school. And as we build that muscle and as we build that confidence that they really do have this responsibility, primarily because they have the relationships and they have more relevance than a lot of the folks who are in the school sometimes. Because they have those relationships and those opportunities to connect with the young people and their families in more authentic ways, I think we can build on that idea that they're not just teachers in young people's lives, but there are coaches, there are librarians, there are mentors, there are neighbors, there are people who are in their lives who have experiences and connections with them in multiple contexts, that if we can broaden the definition of teaching and learning to be about these broader life skills and goals and not just about academic content, from which a lot of people shy away and go, well, I'm not trained to do that, I think we can slowly do it. So I really look forward to continuing to partner with you as you develop this Learning Happens Everywhere campaign, and help you move it up the age range. And I really appreciate the time that you've taken to spend with us today.
Well, Karen, I am so grateful to you for the opportunity and look forward to having a chance to continue the conversation. And with you leading this overall effort, I have increased confidence that we're in good hands and that your optimism will fuel something quite wonderful. And I am going to be following you every step of the way.
Well, you don't get to follow me because I'm joining you, so I'll be standing next to you. You won't have to look far.